Invitation to a Beheading by Vladimir Nabokov. Chapter 1. In accordance with the law, the death sentence was announced to Cincinnatus C. in whisper. All rose, exchanging smiles. The hoary judge put his mouth close to his ear, panted for a moment, made the announcement, and slowly moved away as though ungluing himself. Thereupon Cincinnatus was taken back to the fortress. The road wound around its rocky base and disappeared under the gate like a snake in a crevice. He was calm, however he had to be supported during the journey through the long corridors, since he planted his feet unsteadily, like a child who has just learned to walk, or as if he were about to fall through, like a man who has dreamt he is walking on water only to have a sudden doubt. But is this possible? Rogion the jailer took a long time to unlock the door of Cincinnatus's cell. It was the wrong key, and there was the usual fuss. At last the door yielded. Inside, the lawyer was already waiting. He sat on the cot, shoulder deep in thought, without his dress coat, which had been forgotten on a chair in the courtroom. It was a hot day, a day that was blue all through. He jumped impatiently when the prisoner was brought in. But Cincinnatus was in no mood for talking, even if the alternative was solitude in this cell, with its peephole like a leak in a boat. He did not care, and asked to be left alone. They all bowed to him and left. So we are nearing the end. The right hand, still untasted part of the novel, which, during our delectable reading, we would lightly feel, mechanically testing whether there was still plenty left, and our fingers were always gladdened by the placid, faithful thickness, has suddenly, for no reason at all, become quite meagre. A few minutes of quick reading already downhill, and oh, horrible! The heap of cherries, whose mass had seemed to us of such a ruddy and glossy black, had suddenly become discreet drupes. The one over there with the scar is a little rotten, and this one is shriveled and dried up around its stone, and the very last one is inevitably hard and unripe. Oh, horrible! Cincinnatus took off his silk jerkin, put on his dressing gown, and, stamping his feet a little to stop the shivering, began walking around the cell. On the table glistened a clean sheet of paper, and, distinctly outlined against this whiteness, lay a beautifully sharpened pencil, as long as the life of any man except Cincinnatus, and with an ebony gleam to each of its 6 facets, an enlightened descendant of the index finger. Cincinnatus wrote, "In spite of everything, I am comparatively... After all, I had premonitions of this finale." Rogion was standing on the other side of the door and peering, with a skipper's stern attention, through the peephole. Cincinnatus felt a chill on the back of his head. He crossed out what he had written and began shading gently. An embryonic embellishment appeared gradually and curled into a ram's horn. Oh, horrible! Rogion gazed through the blue porthole at the horizon, now rising, now falling. Who was becoming seasick? Cincinnatus. He broke out in a sweat, everything grew dark, and he could feel the rootlet of every hair. A clock struck 4 or 5 times, with the vibrations and revibrations and reverberations proper to a prison. Feet working, a spider, official friend of the jailed, lowered itself on a thread from the ceiling. No one, however, knocked on the wall, since Cincinnatus was as yet the sole prisoner in such an enormous fortress. Some time later, Rogion the jailer came in and offered to dance a waltz with him. Cincinnatus agreed. They began to whirl. The keys on Rogion's leather belt jangled. He smelled of sweat, tobacco, and garlic. He hummed, puffing into his red beard, and his rusty joints creaked. He was not what he used to be, alas. Now he was fat and short of breath. The dance carried them into the corridor. Cincinnatus was much smaller than his partner. Cincinnatus was light as a leaf. The wind of the waltz made the tips of his long but thin mustache flutter, and his big, limpid eyes looked askance, as is always the case with timorous dancers. He was indeed very small for a full-grown man. Marta used to say that his shoes were too tight for her. At the bend in the corridor stood another guard, nameless, with a rifle and wearing a dog-like mask with a gauze mouthpiece. They described a circle near him and glided back into the cell, and now Cincinnatus regretted that the swoon's friendly embrace had been so brief. With banal dreariness, the clock struck again. Time was advancing in arithmetical progression. It was now 8. The ugly little window proved accessible to the sunset. A fiery parallelogram appeared on the side wall. The cell was filled to the ceiling with the oils of twilight, containing extraordinary pigments. Thus one would wonder, is that some reckless colorist's painting there to the right of the door, or another window, an ornate one of a kind that already no longer exists? Actually, it was a parchment sheet hanging on the wall with 2 columns of detailed rules for prisoners, the bent corner, the red letters of the heading, the vignettes, the ancient seal of the city, namely a furnace with wings, provided the necessary materials for the evening illumination. The cell's quota of furniture consisted of a table, a chair, and the cot. Dinner, those condemned to death were entitled to get the same meals as the wardens, had already been standing and growing cold on its zinc tray for a long time. It grew quite dark. Suddenly the place was filled with golden, highly concentrated electric light. Cincinnatus lowered his feet from the cot. A bowling ball rolled through his head, diagonally from nape to temple. It paused and started back. Meanwhile, the door opened, and the prison director entered. He was dressed, as always, in a frock coat, and held himself exquisitely straight, chest out, one hand in his bosom, the other behind his back. A perfect toupee, black as pitch, and with a waxy parting, smoothly covered his head. His face, selected without love, with its thick sallow cheeks and somewhat obsolete system of wrinkles, was enlivened in a sense by 2, and only by 2, bulging eyes. Moving his legs evenly in his columnar trousers, he strode from the wall to the table, almost to the cot. But, in spite of his majestic solidity, he calmly vanished, dissolving into the air. A minute later, however, the door opened once again, this time with the familiar grating sound, and, dressed as always in a frock coat, his chest out, in came the same person. "Having learned from trustworthy sources that your fate has been sort of sealed," he began in a fruity bass, "I have deemed it my duty, dear sir." Cincinnatus said, "Kind. You. Very." This still had to be arranged. "You are very kind," said an additional Cincinnatus, having cleared his throat. "Mercy!" exclaimed the director, unmindful of the tactlessness of that word. "Mercy! Think nothing. Duty, I always. But why, may I be so bold as to ask, have you not touched your food?" The director removed the cover and raised to his sensitive nose the bowl of coagulated stew. He took a potato with 2 fingers and began to chew powerfully, already picking out with an eyebrow something on another dish. "I do not know what better food you could want," he said with displeasure, and, shooting out his cuffs, sat down at the table so as to be more comfortable while eating the rice pudding. Cincinnatus said, "I should like to know if it will be long now." "Excellent, Sabayon. Should still like to know if it will be long now. Unfortunately, I myself do not know. I am always informed at the last moment. I have complained many times and can show you all the correspondence on the subject if you are interested." "So it may be tomorrow morning?" asked Cincinnatus. "If you are interested," said the director. Yes, downright delicious and most satisfying, that is what I'll tell you. And now, pour la digestion, allow me to offer you a cigarette. Have no fear, at most this is only the one before last, he added, wittily. It's not out of curiosity that I ask, said Cincinnatus. It's true that cowards are always inquisitive, but I assure you, even if I can't control my chills and so forth, that does not mean anything. A rider is not responsible for the shivering of his horse. I want to know why, for this reason, the compensation for a death sentence is knowledge of the exact hour when one is to die. A great luxury, but one that is well earned. However, I'm being left in that ignorance which is tolerable only to those living at liberty. And furthermore, I have in my head many projects that were begun and interrupted at various times. I simply shall not pursue them if the time remaining before my execution is not sufficient for their orderly conclusion. This is why— "Oh, will you please stop mumbling?" the director said irritably. "In the first place, it is against the rules, and in the second, I am telling you in plain Russian, and for the second time, I do not know. All I can tell you is that your fate-mate is expected to arrive any day now, and when he does arrive, and has rested, and got used to the surroundings, he will still have to test the instrument, if, of course, he has not brought his own, which is altogether likely. How's the tobacco? Not too strong?" "No," answered Cincinnatus, after looking absent-mindedly at his cigarette. "Only it seems to me that according to the law, not you, perhaps, but the administrator of the city is supposed to—" "We've had our chat, and that will do," said the director. "Actually, I came here not to listen to complaints, but to—" Blinking, he rummaged first in one pocket, then in another. Finally, from an inside breast pocket, he produced a sheet of ruled paper, obviously torn from a school notebook. "There's no ashtray here," he observed, gesturing with his cigarette. "Oh, well, let us drown it in what's left of the rest of this sauce. So, I would say the light is a bit harsh. Maybe if we— Oh, never mind, it will have to do." He unfolded the paper, and, without putting on his horn-rimmed glasses, but holding them in front of his eyes, he began to read, distinctly. "Prisoner, in this solemn hour when all eyes—" "I think we had better stand," he interrupted himself with concern, and rose from his chair. Cincinnatus also rose. "Prisoner, in this solemn hour when all eyes are upon thee, and thy judges are jubilant, and thou art preparing for those involuntary bodily movements that directly follow severance of the head, I address to thee a parting word. It is my lot, and this I will never forget, to provide thy sojourn in jail with all that multitude of comforts which the law allows. I shall therefore be glad to devote all possible attention to any expression of thy gratitude, preferably, however, in written form and on one side of the sheet." "There," said the director, folding his glasses. "That will be all. I shall not keep you any longer. Let me know if you should need anything." He sat down at the table and began to write rapidly, thus indicating that the audience was over. Cincinnatus went out. On the corridor wall dozed the shadow of Rodion, hunched over on the shadow of a stool, with only a fringe of a beard outlined in rufus. Further on, at the bend in the wall, the other guard had taken off his uniform mask and was wiping his face with his sleeve. Cincinnatus started down the stairs. The stone steps were narrow and slippery, with the impalpable spiral of a ghostly railing. Upon reaching the bottom, he again went along corridors. A door with the sign "Office" in mirror-like inversion was wide open. Moonlight glistened on an inkwell, and a wastebasket rustled and rattled furiously under the table. A mouse must have fallen into it. Cincinnatus, after passing many other doors, stumbled, hopped, and found himself in a small courtyard, filled with various parts of the dismantled moon. This night the password was silence, and the soldier at the gate responded with silence to Cincinnatus's silence and let him pass, likewise at all the other gates. Leaving behind the misty mass of the fortress, he began to slide down a steep, dewy bank of turf, reached a pale path between cliffs, twice, 3 times crossed the bends of the main road, which, having finally shaken off the last shadow of the fortress, ran more straight and free, and a filigrane bridge across a dried-up rivulet brought Cincinnatus into the city. He climbed to the top of a steep incline, turned left on Garden Street, and sped past a shrubbery in greyish bloom. A lighted window flashed somewhere. Behind some fence a dog shook its chain but did not bark. The breeze was doing all it could to cool the fugitive's bare neck. Now and then a wave of fragrance would come from the Tamara Gardens. How well he knew that public park. There, where Martha, when she was a bride, was frightened of the frogs and cockchafers. There, whenever life seemed unbearable, one could roam, with a meal of chewed lilac bloom in one's mouth and firefly tears in one's eyes. That green, turfy tamarack park, the languor of its ponds, the tum-tum-tum of a distant band. He turned on Matterfact Street, past the ruins of an ancient factory, the pride of the town, past whispering lindens, past the festive-looking white bungalows of the telegraph employees, perpetually celebrating somebody's birth date, and came out on Telegraph Street. From there a narrow lane went uphill, and again the lindens began to murmur discreetly. 2 men, supposedly on a bench, were quietly conversing in the obscurity of a public garden. "I say he's wrong," said one. The other replied unintelligibly, and both gave a kind of sigh which blended naturally with the sough of the foliage. Cincinnatus ran out into a circular plaza, where the moon stood watch over the familiar statue of a poet that looked like a snowman, a cube for a head, legs stuck together, and, after a few more pattering steps, was in his own street. On the right, the moon cast dissimilar patterns of branches on the walls of similar houses, so that it was only by the expression of the shadows, by the interciliary bar between 2 windows, that Cincinnatus recognized his own house. Marta's top-floor window was dark, but open. The children must be sleeping on the hook-nosed balcony. There was a glimpse of something white there. Cincinnatus ran up the front steps, pushed open the door, and entered his lighted cell. He turned around, but already he was locked in. Oh, horrible! The pencil glistened on the table. The spider sat on the yellow wall. "Turn off the light!" shouted Cincinnatus. His observer through the peephole turned it off. Darkness and silence began to merge, but the clock interfered. It struck 11 times, thought for a moment, and struck once more, and Cincinnatus lay supine, gazing into the dark, where bright dots were scattering and gradually disappearing. Darkness and silence merged completely. It was then and only then, that is, lying supine on a prison cot after midnight, after a horrible, I simply cannot tell you what a horrible day, that Cincinnatus C. clearly evaluated his situation. At first, against the background of that black velvet which lines at night the underside of the eyelids, Marta's face appeared as in a locket. Her doll-like rosiness, her shiny forehead with its childlike convexity, her thin eyebrows slanting upward, high above her round hazel eyes. She began to blink, turning her head, and there was a black velvet ribbon on her soft, creamy white neck, and the velvety quiet of her dress flared at the bottom, blending with the darkness. That is how he saw her among the audience, when they led him up to the freshly painted defendant's bench, on which he did not dare sit, but stood beside it. And still he got emerald paint all over his hands, and the newspaper men greedily photographed the fingerprints he had left on the back of the bench. He could see their tense foreheads. He could see the gaudy pantaloons of the fops, and the hand mirrors and iridescent scarves of the women of fashion, but the faces were indistinct. Of all the spectators, he remembered only round-eyed Marta. The defense counsel and the prosecutor, both wearing makeup and looking very much alike, The law required that they be uterine brothers, but such were not always available, and then makeup was used. Spoke with virtuoso rapidity the 5,000 words allotted to each. They spoke alternately, and the judge, following the rapid exchanges, would move his head, right and left, and all the other heads followed suit. Only Marta, half turned, sat motionless like an astonished child, her gaze fixed on Cincinnatus, standing next to the bright green park bench. The defense counsel, an advocate of classic decapitation, won easily over the inventive prosecutor, and the judge summed up the case. Fragments of these speeches, in which the words translucence and opacity rose and burst like bubbles, now sounded in Cincinnatus's ears, and the rush of blood became applause, and Marta's locket-like face remained in his field of vision and faded only when the judge, who had moved so close that on his large swarthy nose he could see the enlarged pores, one of which, on the very extremity, had sprouted a lone but long hair, pronounced in a moist undertone, "With the gracious consent of the audience, you will be made to don the red top hat," a token phrase that the courts had evolved, whose true meaning was known to every schoolboy. "And yet I have been fashioned so painstakingly," thought Cincinnatus as he wept in the darkness. "The curvature of my spine has been calculated so well, so mysteriously. I feel, tightly rolled up in my calves, so many miles that I could yet run in my lifetime. My head is so comfortable." The clock struck a half, pertaining to some unknown hour.